Hello and welcome to the final lecture for this class, Reconstruction. This was a political reform movement which took place immediately following the end of the Civil War, as many tried to heal the nation's wounds in the aftermath of the most devastating war in American history. There are a few themes to be addressed in this lecture. The first topic will be a profile of the various leaders involved with Reconstruction. 2 presidents will be discussed, as well as some of the members of Congress. Secondly, the various goals and accomplishments of those leaders will be analyzed. Different groups emerged, which had their own attitudes about the actions the nation should take. Finally, the end of Reconstruction will also be discussed. There's one thing you probably want to keep in mind as you're going through this lecture or doing any reading on this subject. That would be an evaluation of Reconstruction. Do you think this political reform movement was a success or a failure? A little background information and definition of what is meant by the term Reconstruction would be a good place to start. The Civil War had ended by 1865, yet there were several results of the war which had to be addressed. First, there was a tremendous loss of life. This was the bloodiest war in American history. How could the nation recover? Secondly, the South's economy was destroyed. In what ways would it be rebuilt? Finally, what would become of the former slaves? Would they be full citizens? Would land be distributed to them? Leaders throughout the country weren't sure. Here is a textbook definition of Reconstruction's primary focus. It was the process of putting the nation back together following the Civil War. Presidents had their own attitudes toward Reconstruction. The first president who had to deal with it was Abraham Lincoln. He had a unique plan to reunite the nation. Abraham Lincoln issued his Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction during the war in 1863. Some people called this the 10% Plan because of its leniency and provisions. Essentially, 10% of the voters in the Confederate States had to accept 2 things: emancipation of the slaves, and they had to swear loyalty to the Union. Also, high-ranking Confederate officials could participate in this new government, but in order to do so, they had to receive a presidential pardon. Lastly, once these provisions were met, a state could return to the Union. This plan was noted for its leniency, as Lincoln wanted to make it easy for the Confederate States to return to the Union. Supporters of a lenient peace saw their hopes dashed when Abraham Lincoln attended a play in April of 1865. He was shot at point-blank range by the famous actor John Wilkes Booth while attending the play Our American Cousin at the now famous Ford's Theater. The nation mourned its fallen president, as is shown with this image on the left. You may want to visit the website below, as it identifies several of the conspiracy theories associated with the Lincoln assassination. Many theories have run rampant because Lincoln wasn't the only person targeted for assassination on that date. Several others, including members of Lincoln's cabinet, as well as his vice president, were supposed to be killed on that night. However, only Booth was successful in killing his target. There were several others who also influenced Reconstruction at this time. We'll talk about them next. Following the death of Abraham Lincoln, there were a variety of people who began to influence Reconstruction. However, it might be best to focus on just 3. The first 2, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, were members of Congress, and they were radical Republicans. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president, who assumed the presidency following Lincoln's assassination. You may or may not be familiar with the phrase radical Republicans. In this context, they were members of the Republican Party with 2 primary goals. They wanted to punish the South for causing the Civil War, and they also fought to protect the rights of former slaves. Below is a hyperlink for more information about radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens was a leading radical Republican in the House of Representatives. For many years, he was committed to the cause of racial equality and demonstrated this while planning for his own funeral. He asked that he be buried in a cemetery alongside African Americans. His goal when it came to Reconstruction was to focus on economic opportunity for former slaves and supported a program which would distribute land to blacks. Another radical Republican was this man, Charles Sumner, who was also a member of the United States Senate. In the years leading up to the Civil War, he was a staunch opponent of slavery and continued to fight on behalf of the rights of African Americans after the end of the war. This image depicts an event which took place in 1857 on the floor of the United States Senate just a few years before the start of the Civil War. Charles Sumner had previously delivered a speech in which he criticized slavery in general and slaveholders in particular. Preston Brooks, who was a member of the United States House of Representatives, took offense at this speech. He went to the floor of the Senate and physically beat Sumner over the head with a cane. This demonstrated how heated the division had become among Americans in the years before the Civil War. During the era of Reconstruction, Sumner used his influence in the Senate to fight and secure citizenship and political rights for former slaves. In addition to these radical Republicans, there's another individual who influenced Reconstruction who eventually found himself impeached. The third person to influence events following the death of Lincoln was this man, Andrew Johnson. Johnson had formerly been a senator from Tennessee and served as vice president before Lincoln's death. He was a bit of a controversial running mate for Lincoln because of his roots in Tennessee and the fact that Johnson was a Democrat. This map identifies several southern states during the Civil War. Notice where Tennessee is located. Johnson's home state of Tennessee fought with the Confederacy during the war, yet Johnson was the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union. This is why Lincoln chose Johnson to be his vice president when he ran for re-election in 1864. Lincoln demonstrated his desire to preserve the Union by choosing a Democrat, Lincoln was a Republican, who supported the Union over his home state. Many were concerned how a Southerner would respond in the White House to Reconstruction, and Johnson undertook some controversial actions which added to this concern. He issued some 13,000 pardons, many of which went to former members of the Confederacy, which made many uneasy. He then demonstrated his lack of concern for the rights of former slaves when he took no action as several states began to pass what were called black codes. Black codes became law in several states of the former Confederacy. Essentially, these established conditions which were very similar to slavery for African Americans. Typical regulations barred blacks from leaving plantations. In most states, interracial marriages were prohibited, and African Americans could neither serve on juries nor testify in court against whites. You may click on the hyperlinks below to view websites for additional information on black codes. Johnson also came into conflict with members of Congress because of his opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau. This organization was created in order to issue things like food, clothing, and medical supplies. In general, it was designed to oversee relief activities created to help former slaves. They also established many schools for black children. Here we see one of these newly established schools. I don't know if you can tell this from the picture, but we see black teachers and students, all of whom are barefoot. The Bureau also helped to reunify families which had been separated when slavery had been legal. Congress voted to extend the funding for this program, however Johnson vetoed its renewal in 1866. Largely due to his lack of concern for the rights of former slaves, Andrew Johnson became the first president in American history to be impeached.